What's going on, guys? Jared here. This is the Run with Tobe podcast. This is episode 9. I have Andrew on the line. I also have a special guest. Let's go ahead and get right into it. Hey, what's going on, Andrew?
Not much, man. We just got back from a pretty cool trip in the beautiful Pacific Northwest. We were up in Portland for a few hours.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
Then booked it out towards Bend, Oregon, which is an awesome part of the country. I've actually never been up there before. We were visiting a vodka company, Black Infusions. So if you guys want to check them out, they're Black Fig Vodka. But it was a really cool trip. We got to film their whole production process, got to eat some pretty amazing food up there, enjoyed the nice clean air outside of LA. So I guess we're back in LA now.
Yeah, and it was warm for a couple days when we got back, but now it's cold again. Well, LA cold.
Cold being
59.
like 50-ish.
Yeah, something like that, right? No, but yeah, you're right. Bend was beautiful. Portland looked cool when we saw it for that few seconds.
Yep.
Hopefully we can get back there again, do some projects up in that part of the country. I had never been there either. It was beautiful and amazing. And that 3-hour drive was probably one of the better long distance drives that I've been a part of and not been completely bored. It wasn't like driving through like East Texas, which is like nothing.
Yeah, well, and for those who've not been to that part, it's really interesting because you come from Portland, which is, it's kind of like rainy, cloudy, kind of like Seattle, and then you drive through the mountains and you get that sort of mountain kind of climate, which is basically snow at the time, or a little bit of snow, and then you pop out of the mountains and you're basically in this high desert sort of environment, which is like in LA, if you're from LA, you got out of the mountains and then you get into Palm Springs from like Mammoth Mountain, for example. So it was cool. Cool to see the different changes in geography and a cool part of the job too, actually.
Yeah,
right?
and the terrain was crazy. And like someone mentioned up there when we were doing the project, surprisingly, Bend has 360 days of sunshine or something like that.
Yep.
So almost the entire year. So it's kind of like LA, but obviously a lot more frigid.
Yep.
It's deep winter, like you like to call it up there. We did hit that snow on the way back in a little bit while we were there. But yeah, great project. Black Infusions was nice enough to bring us on board to do the project. And yeah, looking forward to the final result. Filmed a bunch of cool stuff, hung out at their distillery. And yeah, it was a cool experience all overall. I've never been part of any of that. So getting to see all that firsthand was great.
For sure.
Cool, man. Well, let's go ahead and jump into the ads and commercial world for a second. What has been catching your attention?
Yeah, so I didn't realize this, but the Nintendo Switch has become a really popular gaming platform.
It really has.
Unfortunately, I just don't have enough time these days to play video games.
You sound old.
So I was a PlayStation guy for a little bit, and then I switched over to Xbox, and for a hot minute, I was on the Wii. And then probably for the past 5 years, I kind of just haven't been paying attention to that space, but I saw a commercial for a Nintendo Switch, and it was basically a commercial which kind of showed, it was a really good way to show all the innovative features of the product, which was, it's basically like a PSP or like a portable PlayStation unit or like a Game Boy.
Yeah. Game Gear. Sega fans out there.
And so you can take it on the go, but there's a docking unit, which you can basically plug it into, and it allows you to use it like a regular console, like an Xbox or a PlayStation. And so the commercial kind of shows them kind of walking through playing the game like on their own, and then doing multiplayer through, I think, the Bluetooth functionality or whatever functionality they have to network devices together with their friends, and then plugging it in at the very end, in their family room and, playing like you normally would think of a regular console unit. So I thought that was a pretty cool ad. We'll link up the ad in the show notes. But again, just a really cool way to show an innovative product and how it works in very kind of natural settings, which sometimes we forget,
Yeah. I think that Nintendo has done a great job in general rebranding themselves.
Totally. Yeah.
They went through that. I don't know. The Wii, the original Wii wasn't as successful, I think, as they hoped. But part of the problem is they have always been fighting this battle where, hardcore gamers don't get the games Nintendo that they would on a PlayStation,
Yeah.
Xbox, or a PC. So I think a lot of hardcore gamers kind of, give it a bad rap because it's not the hardcore gaming system. If you want that, go buy the PlayStation or the Xbox. It's in a different space. It's more of the friends, family, fun time, party time environment. And I think that's what Nintendo was best at back in the 80s when they were doing their thing, in the 90s.
Yep.
When they were doing their thing. But yeah, it's I've never actually used it myself.
Me neither, but I'll tell you one thing, dude. Like, after I saw that ad,
you want to go out and buy one?
I want to go buy
All
one
right,
now.
Amazon, click, order, and it'll be at the office today.
What about you, man?
So for me, mine is I'm actually going to throw a little shade at a company that we love to give praise to here on the podcast. I know everybody thinks we're Apple fanboys, which to an extent we are, but their new device that has come out in a new space is not doing as well as they hoped, at least publicly. I don't know what the numbers are. I didn't check that, but everybody is into smart speakers. Sonos, Google has their flagship now. Amazon is doing their flagship, and these are all smart speakers, quote unquote, with digital assistants, things like that. So the HomePod came out. It got announced last year, got delayed. A lot of people, got pissed off for whatever reason. Then they finally released it, I believe at the end of January is when it first came out. And it's a little bit disappointing, man. And it goes from, the product is obviously disappointing a lot of people. To me, it looks like it's just another typical Apple play. We're going to put something out there after everybody else does, and we're just going to keep versioning it up till it gets better. So I know in the long run, I think it will win. But right now, it's kind of disappointing. And the thing that disappointed me is the ads around it. Usually Apple's creative is amazing and they tell a story and they make you feel emotional about their products. This series of ads that they've been running lately for, I think it's just the first round for the HomePod, focuses on the main feature that they're trying to sell, and that's the speaker itself. That's the quality of the sound. So their ads are, I think the coolest thing about their ad is the music choice, that they're choosing popular pop tracks. They're like hip hop and more dancey type tracks. So it's it gives you that dynamic range in sound. But the ad is literally just the word HomePod echoed through space it's just text on black space basically, and it's echoed, meaning it just keeps repeating itself in various fashions. There's one that's like an EQ, so it looks like it's an EQ, but it says HomePod over and over and over. Then there's a couple ones that look really distorted, where they distort the text. I know it took these guys some time to build because I've been in that world. So I do know behind the process, it was, technically there's some cool things that are going on, how it's reacting to the music and things like that. But from a visual standpoint, if I were just a regular somebody, I would just think, oh, they did this on an iPhone. They just put some text over black space on an iPhone and send it off. So it's a little bit disappointing, a little anticlimactic.
Maybe it's a little bit to do with the fact that her heart wasn't maybe fully into this product and it kind of was plagued with some issues from the beginning, right? Possibly,
yeah. And they don't highlight any of the other features of the smart speaker, and that's the whole idea of this thing. It's $350, so I would think that they'd want to highlight the fact that it has Siri, the fact that it has the capability of being placed in anywhere in the room. And the sound quality is great, and they don't relay any of that through this. They focus solely on like, oh, this is a really badass speaker, which it is, and that's the one thing it keeps getting praises for, is how great it sounds. But you don't really get that through this ad. You can't see it, and you certainly can't hear it if you don't have a good system set up. You're not going to hear what they're trying to relay through this messaging. So
maybe it was just Apple's kind of half-hearted attempt to get into the audio space in the living room. And we're actually going to talk about how important the audio space is with our upcoming guests.
Exactly. So. Yeah. So I don't know. I was just disappointed. We'll link it up in the show notes, guys. Hopefully the next series of ads that they have come out will be better, more along the lines of like what they did with the iPad Pro, which actually that ad got a lot of flack because seriously, who sits in a tree and draws on an iPad? But at least it had a little bit of a storyline. So yeah, so we'll link those up in the show notes, guys, like I said. And that's going to bring us to the next section, which is what cool piece of software or app or website tool have you been using?
Yeah, so this is it's not a new tool I've been using, but it's one I've definitely been exposed to before, and I think a lot of the listeners out there may have as well. It's a tool called Typeform, and basically what it is, it's a survey software. And there's SurveyMonkey, there's a few other ones that are out there, but clearly, like Typeform's sort of value proposition to not only the person issuing the survey, but the people taking the survey is a great user experience. When I think of online surveys, I think of these like tiny little radio buttons, and I've got to like click through these like a gazillion different screens,
or just
and all
read forever.
Exactly, right. And so what they've done is they found a way to kind of artfully create surveys.
Cool.
And for the person who's doing this or issuing the survey, to put some of their own branding on it. There's little things that
Google Form does something similar to that, right?
Yes, they do actually. Yep.
And yeah, that one's kind of cool.
And so the cool thing that with Typeform is that they thought about all these little details, and I'll talk about it from the person who's developing and pushing the survey out, which are, just easier little things that you can do to create the survey, make edits to it, and it's just visually, it's a lot easier on the eyes. It's a much nicer environment to work in. But as the person taking the survey, what it does is it has this kind of parallax sort of feature where as you click, it kind of scrolls down and you have this nice, like smooth transition into the next question.
Similar to like an animation you'd see on your phone.
Totally. Exactly. Right. And so it's cool to see that, this company has caught on fire over the past few years, but, I recently issued a pretty long survey. And I think everything that you can do to make the user experience a little bit better, to get them not be like, oh, I hate this thing. Let me get this through this thing. To make it a little bit better helps you get more accurate answers. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Less biased
people are
answers.
they're interested in what they're actually taking the survey for.
Yeah. It's all about mindset. So if you're already kind of in a...
Right. Like, oh my God, this feels like somebody standing in front of me with a clipboard.
Exactly. Right. I think they've tried to address that. So Typeform has been a great tool for us. I've been using it a lot more for some of our marketing surveys, and they have a free plan. Obviously it has some features that are clipped on it, but if you're using surveys, it's something that I think you should check out.
Yeah, totally. That's a great tool for any startup company that needs to put out surveys, because getting that data is super valuable. Where does it, or how does it populate and send you the data back? Do they give you a visual of the data, or is it just a spreadsheet?
So you have they visualize it for you within the software or on the website. So you can also export it as a PDF, and then you can also export the raw data as a spreadsheet. So you can run pivot tables, do all the crazy analysis you need to on it with the raw data.
Cool.
So it's a cool tool. What about you?
Oh, sorry, I had one last question.
Yeah, what's up?
You're so bored with talking about surveys, you want to get out of it. No, the last question I had is: Do you think are they protecting that data? They're not like selling it to a third party, right? Because they're aggregating all this data from all these different forms. I'm sure they could use it to sell the next version of whatever product they want.
That's a good point. I don't know for sure, actually. I would hope that they're not. But I would assume that the data is your data to own.
I figured.
And they probably have, I take that back. I was going to say, they probably have so much data they can't go through it, but now all this technology.
There's tons of AI bots working right now as we speak.
That's a good question, actually. I should go probably read the terms of service.
For any conspiracy theorists out there, if you want to hit us up and think that they're selling your data, let us know. Okay, so for mine, it is something that I've been using a lot, and it's not as business driven, I guess you could say. I use it for us, but in a weird kind of way. It's this website called kit.com. It is an amazing website. I'm surprised it took so long for this to come out. Actually, I have no idea how long they've been around, but it got popular in this last year. And basically what it is a curation site for equipment to use. So we'll use the podcast. This is a great example, right? If you want to research how to build a podcast and what tools you need, what equipment you need, you can go to kit.com, search podcast, and you'll get all these people that have put what they're using for their podcast equipment with links. I'm sure you can put affiliate links in there. A lot of people are probably sending affiliate links to Amazon, things like that. Basically, it just curates all that. So if you wanted to put a kit for photography, so if you're a new photographer or a videographer and you want to know what equipment people are using, and you follow, the top person on Instagram, chances are they have a kit profile, and they list all their equipment. It's a great way for somebody who is a professional that wants to help outreach. It's just another channel for them to outreach and show, their process. But it's great if you're doing research and you want to know, how to build these certain kits. I actually saw one on there. There's the business person's kit. It's not called the business person's kit, but it's like the business 101 startup kit. And it's like a list of books and software that they use on their tablet, and
Cool.
even like things like a briefcase and things like that. So if you wanted to like know what you needed to do to get a business started, you can go and find out what XYZ professional is using. Use that as your starting point and buy all the stuff that they're using.
So has this become sort of a go-to research platform for
Totally,
you?
yeah,
when
that's a great way to put it.
A new project, or
yep. I don't know. I mean, I guess it's a go-to. I wouldn't necessarily say if it's a project that we're starting, but for instance, when we were looking at purchasing some microphone equipment for our video equipment, I went on there and I wanted to see what the top guys who do this style of interviewing were using, what type of microphone they were using.
So it's kind of like a social marketplace.
It's a social market with products.
Yep.
But it's not necessarily a product-driven website. I don't know if that makes sense.
It's first about helping, and then secondarily about sending you to that affiliate link.
yeah, exactly. But it's a great way. So there's like, you can go on there and find the top YouTuber and find out what they're using for their vlogging equipment, and it takes a lot of the mystery out of it. Before, I think this is basically, somebody was clever enough to realize that people were going on YouTube and doing these like, hey, this is my studio setup. Let me give you a tour of my studio, or my living room setup, or my vlogging setup. And, all these YouTubers would actually go and post these videos about what they're using for equipment. And somebody figured it out and was like, whoa, this is like a thing. This is a marketplace that we can totally, figure out how to use. So, it's great. It's called kit.com. If you're a professional, if you're just a consumer, if you're a prosumer, whatever level you're at, you can find stuff on there. If you're into, anything from, like I said, business to video to even fitness. I saw, a couple of fitness experts on there putting what, equipment you can use for your house. So, and if you have, something that you do on the side, as like a hobby or whatever, or you have an interesting profession, you can build your kit to show. I don't think there's any limitations.
Just another place for Jared to go find more gear
for us to buy.
to buy.
Yeah, for sure. And we'll definitely link everything up in the show notes, guys. We'll put in there. And with that being said, we're going to go ahead and jump into the guest portion of our podcast. On the line right now, we have Sam Balter. He is currently the host of the HubSpot podcast called Weird Work. Weird Work was actually listed on Inc. Magazine's top 10 business podcast to check out. It's also popped up in the iTunes new and noteworthy listen. Definitely check it out, guys. It's a cool podcast. Let me just give you some highlight points for Sam. This guy is a science fiction and barbecue chicken near and dear to his heart type of guy. And of course, naturally, being the host of Weird Work, Sam has had some weird and interesting jobs himself. He was in the junior Canadian mining industry. He was a consultant for multiple co-working spaces, and he was one of those sign twirling guys outside the sandwich shop. But currently, like we said before, he holds a dual identity at HubSpot, actually. He's Weird Work host by night and the senior marketing manager for sales enablement by day. So, what's going on, Sam? How's it going?
It's going good. How are you doing?
Good. Thanks for taking the time out to be on this podcast with us.
Yeah, super excited.
Cool. So, all right, why don't you go ahead and just give us the elevator pitch of Weird Work. So for everybody out there that hasn't heard it, they can kind of get an idea of what it is.
Yeah. So Weird Work is an awesome podcast. Basically, what we do is we talk to people who have found all these interesting, inspiring careers that are outside of the normal 9 to 5. So we talk to people who have jobs like professional cuddler. We've talked to people who are scent makers. We've talked to people like Will Shorts, who's the editor of the New York Times crossword puzzle. People have found like all these amazing and inspiring ways to work outside of kind of the normal career trajectory.
That's really cool. And that brings up an interesting point. Like you were saying, they found these interesting ways to kind of do things that they love and make a living at it. Often we hear people who are, at a 9 to 5 type job that they have all these hobbies, but they can't figure out how to make a career out of it. And it seems like you guys are finding all these people under these crazy hidden stones that are finding these jobs, and they just kind of do what they love.
There are people who just like love what they do so much and have found a way to turn it into a whole career and a passion and a way that kind of is really unexpected and interesting.
That's really cool. So while we're on that subject, Andrew, what weird jobs have you had that you wish maybe you could go back in the past and make a reality or like your dream job?
It's a good question. Let me think about this. I wouldn't say there have been weird jobs, but I think I've definitely had some boring jobs in the past. I kind of joke around with Jared. Like I actually kind of started working when I was like 12 years old and started out as a copy boy and did those sorts of things. But, at one point in my life, I was actually a Taekwondo instructor. For about 5 years. So, when you get your black belt in Taekwondo, you actually are responsible for teaching other people. And it was kind of weird to be a 16-year-old kid teaching, people who are in their 40s and 50s and 60s. But that was actually a really good experience. It taught me how to work with people who had different mindsets than you did, and
early management skills.
Yeah, right. It kind of like took the childhood out of me, I guess. But I got a lot of good experience from it.
Damn, what about you, losing Jared? Your childhood at 14.
Exactly, man. I don't know.
So I don't necessarily think I have a weird job. I've done multiple things over the years. I started out working at like a bowling alley, and then, I did a mobile DJ thing for a long time, which led into the bigger DJ thing. But I think the coolest job that I ever had, that if I could go back and say, you know what, I could probably do this for a really long time if I could figure out how to make money. I worked for Sea-Doo for a summer, and I was a test pilot for one of their lines of new jet skis. So all I did all summer was just test drive jet skis.
That sounds like a cool job.
It's so cool, right? But it's only in places like Florida, obviously, right? Because you can't do that. You can't survive in cold weather or places that actually cost money to live at. So I was able to do that for an entire summer, and that was definitely the coolest job I've ever had. It was, it's funny to say, and it sounds terrible, but it was tiring. You're sitting out on the water for basically 10 hours a day. But yeah, other than that, I don't think I've had any weird jobs. So Sam, let's dig in real quick to a couple of these highlighted weird jobs. I mean, you may have more in the old bag back there, but these are the ones that we're highlighting. So what is junior Canadian mining? So
mining, the wonderful world of mining.
Wait, is this crypto mining?
No, everybody had this is before crypto mining. This is old mining, like dirt or things out of the ground. So what I used to do is I used to work for this company. It was a small startup. It was me and this other guy when we started, and we would research mining companies. So like before they've actually start digging stuff out of the ground. So they look around, they explore for different minerals, and then we would write research about these companies and then sell that research to banks. So like I had no experience whatsoever in this. I graduated from a liberal arts school with a degree in history. And then my first job out of college was researching the diamond sector and then being like, how much are diamonds going to be worth? What's a good diamond mine to look like? What's a bad one? All this other sort of things along those lines. And I worked in that for a few years. And then just basically kind of hated a lot of the mining industry and working in sort of the banking industry as well.
Interesting. Okay. So that explains that a little bit. All right.
Yeah, that's a little bit.
Take us to the next thing, which is you were involved with consulting for multiple co-working spaces. Now, this touches pretty close to Andrew and I's heart since we are a pretty new startup. We're actually existing right now inside a co-working space. So we're experiencing that for the first time and getting that dynamic. So give us some insight on what you did.
Yeah, so I worked for two, one in Portland, Oregon, and one in Austin, Texas. And for the one in Portland, Oregon, it was a or attempted to be a democratically run co-working space.
That must have been interesting.
That's not a good idea necessarily to make everything democratic for like people working together. But it was this really fun experience where I worked on a lot of stuff for like pricing strategy and business modeling, doing a lot of the work on sort of like figuring out the financials of the business, how much it needed to grow. So I took a lot of the stuff I had learned in the mining industry from like doing resource modeling and modeling out different businesses, and then I just applied all of that to co-working spaces to see like how many people do we need to be bringing into the co-working space, how much do we need to charge, what is the churn rate of like people from the co-working space, and then how do we adjust our prices based on that. So I did a little bit of consulting along kind of business modeling for it.
So Sam, like a lot of the things you talk about, they don't really have a lot of skills to do with like a liberal arts major. It seems like actually a lot of analytical and math skills. Did you kind of learn this while you first jumped in the mining job and kind of learned on the job, or did you train yourself? How did you get some of these skills?
Yeah, I was really fortunate that the person I was working for took a lot of time to like train me and teach me. He had come from a hedge fund background. And so he taught me a lot of the stuff about metals and mining, and then also being able to like use Excel and what pivot tables are and things like that. And then from there, like I was pretty good at writing and research from my liberal arts degree. So it was like I had a good degree in sort of like looking, reading, understanding problems, consuming a lot of information, but I was able to get a little bit more info on the financial side of it. And I learned a lot of that on the job.
That's awesome.
Yeah,
cool.
That's crazy. Yeah, like I said before, we're experiencing the dynamics of a co-working space. I wouldn't say it's democratic here, but it is interesting working with multiple different companies under one roof. I think the unique thing about the place that we're at is everybody's really kind of communal. So it's not necessarily like a WeWork type model where you're just kind of locked in a cubicle. Everybody kind of roams around, and it almost feels like you work in one unified office, but everybody has their own tasks in different parts of a company. Yeah, it's cool. It's interesting.
Yeah, I love co-working spaces. I think it's great to just see. It's like you get all the feelings of an office, but then you get to have these crazy conversations with people who are doing stuff completely unrelated to what you're doing. And you get to share all this information in like a dense space. Like it feels really cool to learn from a company that's totally different than you and be like, oh, I can take that and apply it. Or like, that's interesting. It's just super informative to like, if you're a curious person, co-working spaces are great.
That's a great way to put it.
Hey, Sam, do you think that the co-working space model, I mean, it's obviously gotten a lot more popular over the past few years, but do you see it getting even more popular, or do you sort of see it kind of plateauing out in its growth?
Oh, yeah. No, I can see it as continuing to grow. Like, it's just, it doesn't seem like there's any reason with the amount of remote work increasing. Sort of like you have this weird parity between cities, or kind of like arbitrage between cities where not everybody can live in San Francisco. Like it's just unaffordable, but like you might want to work for a San Francisco company or Boston or something like that. It's like if it's going to be really expensive in these central areas and people want to work everywhere and there's the technology to work everywhere, building out networks of co-working spaces just makes sense.
Yeah, that's cool. That's an interesting way of looking at it. And I think you just may have solved the traffic problem in LA. If we could get everybody that drives to work to just get into a co-working space in their community, then we can solve the traffic problem. Elon Musk, stop boring tunnels under the city. Even though we think it's cool, stop doing it. All right. So let's go ahead and jump into if you want to talk about twirling signs outside the sandwich shop, that's awesome. But I think everybody kind of knows what that is.
I'll just put one out there. People underestimate how insane that job is. Like it is most mind-numbing job possible to do literally nothing but spin a sign around. It was fun for like 3 days, and then it was just the worst experience. But okay. That's it.
Quick question on that then. What was your song or music of choice during those 3 days?
For me, it was like I was really into La Rue then. And so it was just listening to like La Rue Bulletproof, like over and over and over again, dancing and on the side of the street. That was pretty much my solid. And now I know all the words. I know all the words to the entire album. It's ingrained in my head.
That's awesome. Yeah, and it's funny. We're a content marketing agency, and that's obviously one way of like street marketing. How effective was it?
Not very not effective. No,
if you
sure. Like some people might have come in because of that, but I don't really think it added too much value. I wouldn't recommend people go out there and get really into hiring kids to just wave signs around.
Yeah, it's interesting. So we're about to, be in the height, or we are in the height of tax season, and there's a lot of tax companies that put out people in like Statue of Liberty costumes out on the front of the street. And LA is pretty famous for apartment sign twirlers. You can find those on pretty much any corner that there's an apartment complex. Someone's twirling a sign. So there's like business models that you can build on these sign twirling companies. All right. Well, let's ungracefully segue into what you are doing now. Let's talk about HubSpot, and then we'll jump in more of the weird work stuff.
Yeah, of course.
So what are you currently doing in the marketing manager sales enablement team? What are you doing in that versus like when do you find time to do the podcast?
Yeah. So in my role in sales enablement, basically what I'm doing is I'm working with the North American sales team to kind of effectively leverage like a lot of the marketing content and assets that we have out there, help with sales process, help with training, and add kind of a marketing lens to it. So some of the things that I work on is like I manage our case study library, going out, filming case studies, kind of working on the storylines for those. I manage our customer reference program, so connecting people who are prospective HubSpot customers with like happy HubSpot customers so that they can learn about the product and hear from similar people. I also work for, basically creating kind of some level of competitive intelligence to see, how are we understanding the market and understanding the changes and making sure reps know that information. And then recently, like kind of a fun project I've been working on, like everybody else, like I've gotten into bots. I've gotten into the world of bots. And so I've been experimenting around with using a kind of an internal bot, Slack bot, that sales reps can send questions to. They can get the most up-to-date marketing collateral on. They can request references through it. So it's like this cool way of sort of building a system for reps to get resources on demand.
So Sam, would you say your customer is like the internal sort of HubSpot sales team? Is that who your key customer is, or who do you think you service?
Yeah, I mean, like in the end, I'm always focusing on the customer first. Like it's always about our customer first and making sure that experience is good. But in terms of my like day to day, yeah, my customer is the sales team. It's the sales leadership. It's sales managers. It's the individual reps, making sure they're all happy. That being said, like what solves for them and what makes their lives easier makes customers' lives easier. It means that they're more informed, they're able to provide social proof, they're able to provide references and things like that a lot easier. So what's good for them is good for the customer. Either way, they're both my customers.
And how'd you get to HubSpot from, world famous sign twirler to, senior marketing manager at HubSpot?
Yeah. So before I was at HubSpot, I was working for a small tech company that did mobile messaging. So like short code text messaging campaigns, basically. And I was working at originally in sales, and then basically the head of marketing left. There was a huge gap in like what we were doing in marketing. I was like, I really think we could step it up and like we could do a lot of things here. So I started working on our marketing for that company, which was Waterfall, which later got acquired. I worked on our marketing. And then one of the ways that I did was I had moved us over from Marketo to HubSpot. So I had gone with this process of actually implementing HubSpot. And I knew about HubSpot because I had been At my last company, when it was a startup, I had done all of my self-education through HubSpot. Like I had been reading their blogs for years. I knew the company really well. And I wanted to move us over to a different kind of inbound strategy. Then I moved that whole process, got us moved over into HubSpot. Shortly after that, I moved to Boston with my girlfriend at the time, now wife, for grad school. And I was in Boston and looking for another job. And I was like, obviously, HubSpot would be a great place to work. And that's kind of how I had found myself here.
So a term that I hear a lot in HubSpot is you kind of got inbounded.
I did 100%. I got inbounded. It was a long multi-year process, but yeah, it happened.
That's similar to how we became HubSpot agency partners.
Yeah,
Andrew went down that pipeline.
No, that's really cool, Sam, because, and the reason I asked that is because you had been in so many different types of industries and different types of jobs. And it's really cool to, and I think for a lot of people out there, probably inspiring that like you can actually go out there and become an expert on something by learning stuff on the internet, right? By consuming the right content, learning the stuff, doing your own self-learning. And I think, a lot of people may discount how much of an expert you can actually become by learning that kind of stuff, on your own.
Yeah, I think a lot of people have the misconception that like jobs are related to like genes, oh, I don't have, I'm not a marketing person. I'm not a salesperson. I can't necessarily learn this. I don't have the personality for something like this. But then you realize like it's just a bunch of skills that you can learn. Like there's things you could go out there. You can, if you want to get good at marketing, you could just learn how to do it in the same way you would learn how to do, learn how to play a sport or learn how to cook something. Like if you just research it, do the things people are telling you to do and practice, you will become an expert and you will become better at it.
For sure.
Yeah. I mean, how many times do we hear the excuse, oh, I can't do it for whatever reason? And it's just like anything else in life. It just takes a little bit of time and practice and an actual caring of what you're doing.
And maybe be okay at sucking at it in the beginning.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
Because we all suck at it in the beginning.
Yeah,
right?
For sure. Yeah. Okay. So how did you get involved with HubSpot podcasting?
Yeah. So HubSpot basically has had this one podcast that's been going on for a while, The Growth Show. And it was a great podcast. It's recently relaunching with a focus on turnarounds. But one of the things they wanted to do was launch a second podcast. And where The Growth Show is really very like business oriented, talking to business leaders, real thought leadership, we wanted Weird Work as a way to kind of like reach a broader audience, something a little more fun, a little more digestible, kind of more focused on inspiring and celebrating these interesting careers. And so when they had the idea for this podcast, they were looking for people to host it. And basically, I just applied to host the podcast, sent in, like some information about why I thought I would be good. I did a sample interview with one of my friends who did paintball and just talking to him about paintball. And yeah, it was great because he's a tall dude. He's like a huge, he's like tall and probably weighs like 250 or so pounds. And in like a lot of the interview is me being like, how are you good at paintball? How
can you maneuver?
Yeah, how are you a professional paintball player? And then he was like explained it all to me, and it was like a fun kind of lighthearted interview. And so with that kind of like I got accepted, and then that sort of just kicked off the journey of being part of Weird Work.
That's really cool, and I like the fact that you put yourself out there doing the interview. I don't know if that was required or not, but you put yourself out there to do a test interview to kind of show your chops and show that you had some ability to do this. A lot of people get stuck on the why they should do it, when they should do it, how they should do it, but don't actually do it. So that's cool that you just kind of gave it a shot.
Just go for it. I recorded it. It's like I recorded a shitty thing on my my phone. Like it's just get out there and start doing things, and people will be a lot better off. Don't come up with a bunch of reasons to not do stuff.
Yeah. All right. So let's get into some of the technical side of it, because a lot of people actually ask us how we record our podcast, how we, what equipment to use, what software, kind of the nuts and bolts of it. So what is the technical approach that you guys take for recording? Do you always do everything in a studio environment? And I get this is just more for the listeners out there that, maybe kind of holding back starting because they don't have the equipment or the time or the place to do it.
Yeah. So for Weird Work, we do a mix of both in studio where we have people call in. And then we also occasionally will go out on location to certain places. The vast majority of what we're doing is calling in with people. So we'll basically just record most of it over Zoom primarily. And like a lot of the times we're fortunate enough where sometimes the people have microphones on their end. Sometimes the sound just comes through Zoom, which is fine. We try and send along notes to be in, a quiet environment to make sure whoever we're interviewing is in like a quiet space that's not too echoey. And then we record the interviews that way and then edit them afterwards.
Cool. And guys, we'll link up a couple of these things that Sam's talking about, some of the products, some of the pieces of software that he mentions. We'll link it up in our show notes. So a big part of podcasting is finding interesting guests. And obviously you guys have an angle with, it being, you're looking for these really odd jobs or odd entrepreneurs, if you will. What's your approach to finding these guests? Are you just like hearing about them word of mouth? Are you going to Craigslist? Like, how are you finding them?
Yeah. For us, for like finding guests, it's a combination of things. So on the one hand, there's like stuff that just comes up in the news that you see. Like you might just see somebody is doing something weird or has some sort of interesting story, like a professional wingman. Like that. Somebody will do an article, you'll see something on that, and you'll be like, that would be a great person to talk to. So like one, there's like news come in, you kind of put that on the side. The second is like there's a lot of things that if you just think about it for a little while, like Comic-Con. Like Comic-Con is full of crazy things. What's one of the things that goes on at Comic-Con? Cosplay. Like cosplay is a big one. That's an episode we just released today. And so it's like, okay, well now let's look for people in the cosplay industry. Let's try and find some names who might want to come onto the podcast. So that's kind of another one. And then it's like, as you start to really narrow the topic of what your show is about, you'll just start you'll look at the world through a different lens and notice these things. You'll think about like, there must be a person who does this, like crime scene cleanup. Like
that sounds awful.
Sounds awful, but that is a job. Like that's 100% a job. Somebody has to do that part of the job. We have to talk, like that's obviously a person. Like I was talking to somebody the other day and they were telling me about the standards department of the government, and the standards department of the government, like might work on, he was telling me that his father used to work in the flammable department. So all they do is they just burn stuff in a giant incinerator and then record like how is it flammable or not. And like, that's a crazy job. Like that
is a crazy job.
That's like super weird. So you think like, oh, there's probably other jobs like that in the standards department, or like maybe we should talk to somebody there. And the last part is like, we've been lucky where, there's a listenership that for Weird Work, and people send in all sorts of strange and interesting careers. People email us with different ideas of saying like, I have a friend who's in a weird job, or I'm in a weird job, and I would love to, talk to you or be on the show about it.
That's cool. So going back to like the news story type stuff and some of these weird jobs that you just think of, are you guys just reaching out through email, through social media? Like what's your best way of reaching out to these people?
Yeah, so I'm really fortunate to get to work with a producer on this show, Matt Brown, who does a lot of the kind of outreach to different people. And we've tried a few different mediums. Like he's reached out and connected with people over Instagram as like a way to connect with different people. We've used emails. We've gone through friends and things like that. But I would say primarily email, but don't be afraid to kind of test social channels as well. Like social is a great way to like follow and direct message somebody, and you might just get a response that in email you might have just get kind of knocked to the side.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of again, some of the listeners that have asked us about how we produce our podcast, I think a lot of them they don't have the ability to have somebody who's doing it for them. So I think knowing that it's okay for them to that they should just take a chance and reach out via, email or social, and just kind of get the ball rolling. And obviously it's a numbers game, right? You got to keep reaching out to the more people you reach out to, the more chances you have of landing a guest.
Yeah, and it's not like it's not like somebody's going to respond to you and go, "Okay, I'm down to do this interview in the next 30 minutes." Like if you spend time reaching out to a few people, setting things up the best you can, like you could build kind of a schedule out for your interviews. So I think that makes a lot of sense. People shouldn't be hesitating to connect with guests.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so let's talk about kind of the macro level idea of weird work. What is I mean, I know you touched on it. You guys wanted to open up a second podcast that reached out to a wider audience, but is there a long-term strategy that you guys really have for the podcast?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question to deal with. What is kind of our goals for the podcast?
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah. So at a really basic level, podcasts are a great way to engage with an audience. It's a great way to build trust with an audience. It's a great way to provide helpful and interesting content to people. And I think that's something HubSpot has always been about. If you look at the Academy, HubSpot Academy, we're creating a bunch of great content for people to use and learn things and become better at their jobs. And I think we're doing a very similar thing with weird work, just from a different angle and in a different medium. So our goal is to foster this community and grow this audience of people who are learning about things in different and new ways. So I think that's the kind of large macro goal. The other thing in my mind that I find really interesting is podcasting has been around for a while. Podcasting is kind of I don't know if you're familiar with the Gardner hype cycle, where it's this idea that it's this kind of giant curve of something becomes really, really hyped up and people think it's going to completely change the world. So, autonomous cars are going to be here in the next 2 years and all of us are going to lose jobs and everything's going to be, amazing. And then you fall into this sort of what's called the trough of despair, where people realize that change is not necessarily going to come. And then once you come out of the trough of despair or whatever it is, you end up being more of an institutionalized piece of technology that'll grow steadily over time. And I think podcasting is right in that area. It's growing year over year as a medium. I think it's the most recent stat I saw. It's there's roughly 70 million people who listen to podcasts on a weekly basis. It's been growing, that audience has been growing 10 to 15% year over year. So it's having us get good at podcasting and understanding podcasting is really important as a company that sells and is involved in marketing and sales and education, because this is where people are going. This is how people are consuming content. If you go on a bus, probably, at least a third of the people on 90% of the people on a bus are wearing headphones, and probably 30% of the people on the bus wearing headphones are listening to a podcast.
So piggybacking off that, Sam, as content marketers, we always kind of talk about blogging and, ebooks and white papers and, all those sorts of things, right? And those are certainly a cornerstone to a content marketing strategy, right? But obviously over the past few years, there's a lot of blogs out there. There's a lot of ebooks out there. There's a lot of white papers out there, right? Do you see podcasting as a content format that is going to complement some of these more traditional formats, maybe eventually replace them? What's your thoughts on how it relates to some of the existing content formats that marketers are using today?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think in a lot of ways, it's definitely complementary. I don't see it as something that could ever really replace a lot of those. I think when you think about content on the internet, you have a lot of really good things you could do. that you can't do with just audio. Like I can't show you a graph in the same way. I can't make an animation on that you could then see in a podcast. Like it's just audio. So it's never, I don't think, going to totally replace the world of text. That being said, podcasting it's really, really personable. It's a really good way to connect with people. And so I see it as like very complementary to these broader things. The other thing that I think is really interesting is that like as our ability to rapidly transcribe information, like audio text, like as our ability to do transcriptions, that's going to help bridge the gap between audio focused things and sort of text. And so I think what we'll start to see more of, especially in like interview style shows like this, like you'll see more of people might find something through a search engine. A podcast might be specifically educational. Maybe they'll find the transcript of an interview of that podcast and then start listening to it on in a different way. Like I think it's just like audio books. You know, like sometimes you want to read a book, sometimes you might want to just listen to it. You want to have multiple ways to consume information. And I think certain books do better as audiobooks, certain content does better as a podcast.
Yeah, and it kind of goes back to the point of you always want to find a way to repurpose your content, right? Get as much shelf life as you can out of it. And like you said, if you can transcribe, you know, what you're listening to into something that someone is reading, then that's a great way to kind of repurpose the content.
Yeah, it's like I think when you listen to two people talk or when you hear somebody's voice, it just feels very real. Like it feels very authentic and it's going to resonate with people.
Well, there's a reason that sports talk radio is still around.
Totally,
I mean, no matter how many times you can watch the highlights on ESPN or whatever, sports radio and, you know, stuff like that is never going to go away.
Yeah.
Because it's just a different way to consume it.
Yeah. And I mean, like a lot of sports radio is like no different than like, it's not even adding a lot of value different than the conversations you would just have with your friends. Like, it's just nice to hear people talking about sports and complaining about players and comparing people together. Like it's the same shit you do with everybody else.
And you can choose, you know, what voice you want to, you know, kind of listen to, who has opinions the same way and the views you have on those teams or whatever. You can pick your flavor.
Yeah. And I don't know. I think I think the ability, like as a format, I think one thing that's cool is you're seeing all these different ways that people are using the podcasting format. You know, people are using it in interview shows. People are using it in kind of just like gossipy shows. People are using true crime. People are doing all sorts of different aspects with podcasting that you're like, oh, it's a very flexible medium.
Yeah, absolutely. I think like for me, when I first started really getting into podcasts, was just a lot of people actually listen to the Joe Rogan show, right? And he's like one of the most popular podcasts out there, but the dude talks about so many random things, but he's been able to build such an amazing audience that, you know, maybe they all kind of individually like different things that he's talking about. But I think the spirit of his show and the brand that he's sort of building, it aligns with a lot of these folks. So they have this kind of weird common denominator between them, even though one show can go from MMA to psychedelics to like all these other things, you know what I mean? So it's a really cool way to connect with just very different people out there as well, with the way that you've branded the podcast, not necessarily with the individual content that you're putting out there.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Yeah. And going back to your talk about the podcast cycle. Yeah. I think the first podcast I ever listened to was like 2003 or 2005, somewhere in that zone. Primarily, they were music podcasts. Andrew and I, just quick background for you and anybody else that hasn't heard any other previous episodes. We were DJs, so podcasting was a huge thing back then. Obviously it's blown up even more now, but it was just a way for us to get out like DJ mixes and promos without having to spend a ton of money. We could distribute it over the internet.
Stand on the street corner handing out CDs.
Exactly.
Listen to my mix.
It just replaced that. Yeah. So, cool. All right. So I know I'm assuming you've talked to multiple successful podcasters. You may have even interviewed some. What have you seen like the trends as far as how they're going about monetizing their podcast or promoting their podcast and marketing them. I know you guys, obviously, you have a giant platform called HubSpot that you can market your podcast. But for the littler guys out there, how are they promoting and doing these things to get sponsorship, things like that?
Yeah, so I've been really fortunate to talk to, just recently interviewed with two people who host podcasts. One podcast is Lizard People, which is a great podcast about conspiracy theories. It's very, very funny. It's really like interesting. A really interesting and fun show. And then the other one is a podcast called And This Is Why We Drink, where the podcast is split between paranormal stories. So like stories of the paranormal, and then also stories of kind of true crime situations. So what I've heard and from my own experience with the podcast is like, first, it's important that you are starting off on the foot of like, you know what your podcast is about and you know what type of format the show is. And I think that's really important for people starting out in podcasting, like to set those rules or set those kind of guardrails relatively early. Is this an interview show? Is this an in-depth show? How long are these episodes going to generally be? How do we see this as a show that's serialized? So like Serial, where the show is a certain set number of episodes and then it ends? Or is it a show that's going to go on for a while? So like setting those kind of initial bits so that not only you know what the show is about, but when you're explaining the show to other people, they can easily understand what that show is about. When it comes to growing the show and kind of getting the initial audience for it, there's definitely one route of there's a growing emergence of podcast networks. So like if you think about things like Wondery, if you think about Radiotopia, if you think about all of these kind of like networks like Earwolf that are starting to emerge, that's one route, is to try and create a show that gets picked up by one of these podcasting networks. But if you're just kind of going out and you want to grow the show on your own, leverage whatever audience you can to get it started. Go to any kind of way that you can promote the show or send it out to people initially to get it out there. The next thing I would say is like I've heard from a lot of people about social media, and I think this is a really interesting aspect. Most people don't seem to find new podcasts from social. And I think that's a little counterintuitive, but like it's more common that people find podcasts through things like podcast roundups. Getting featured on something or getting your podcast in front of some sort of roundup or show that it's like top 10 podcasts to make you smile, 5 podcasts in this space. Like find the people who are doing roundups and find the people who are doing interesting work and then try and get connected with them to get your show featured. I think the other thing is like podcasts are very much like, they benefit from talking to each other and working together. So like right now, like this is a good way for Weird Work to grow its podcast audience. When we have, when I've been on Lizard People and when Lizard People comes on our show, like co-marketing together is a really strong way to also grow your audience. So I'd say those are the ways you could kind of organically or somewhat organically grow your audience of your show.
Yeah, those are all great points. The roundups and some of those networks that are kind of forming are kind of the emerging thing since podcasting has become so big. And guys, we will link all those up in the show notes so everybody can kind of check those out. We'll make sure to have those in there. Well, we have about 5 minutes left. One thing I do want to talk about, and you kind of touched on this like briefly, what is your views on the future of the audio space? So we're talking smart speakers, digital assistants. Obviously, you touched on podcasting.
Yeah, I mean, so like broadly, I don't think people want to look at screens as much. I think like at the end of the day, like I think the success of something like Alexa or Google Home or things like that is people want to get to interactions with technology in a more calm way where things are beeping, blinking. We're not necessarily locked into this specific screen-based experience. So I think like you see kind of the pendulum swing away from screens now. which I think is like a very cool, broad sort of trend. And so like, I think one of the things is like, yeah, you're seeing audio being more accessible. You're also seeing the quality, like in the same way that phones have made camera quality go up massively. Like the average person is empowered with all of these great technology for cameras. I got a feeling we're going to be seeing similar things with recording equipment as well. Like people will, over time, I think, recording equipment is only going to get better. Audio is only necessarily going to get better over time. People's ability to do field recordings and things like that is only going to get simpler. And as you make those tools easier, everybody is going to be producing more content, and that content is going to be more easily accessible. I think one of the things that's like a big struggle for audio right now is that it's not indexable in the same way that text is. And whereas text, you could plug a giant search engine into it, audio is a little bit trickier. Audio hasn't quite reached that level. In some ways, it requires curators. It requires people to do things. But like Spotify's move into the podcast space, they're great with analytics. Like they're great with recommendations. Like I see people as being able to find audio and good quality stuff increasing over time. So like the audio space in general, like I think we're like, there's so much we could be doing in audio. And if you just look around, like everybody has headphones in. Like a phenomenon I never had seen until like a few years ago is like I see like teenagers walking around and they'll all have headphones in and be talking to each other. You know, like it's so bizarre, but you see these people and like there'll be like 4 people and they're all listening to different stuff. They're all listening to things on demand and they all have their headphones like glued into their heads. And so like, how is that not going to grow as a space when it's like easier to create? People are using it all the time. We're just scratching the surface of what you could do with audio. We're telling stories in interesting ways. We're doing news over audio. We're doing murder mysteries over audio. Like everything is happening in this space. It seems like it would be, I would be hard pressed to come up with a good reason of why it won't grow.
Right. It's funny you say the headphone thing because Andrew and I are both guilty. So we both wear AirPods all the time.
Yeah.
And we'll be sitting in the office with music playing in the background, wearing them, talking to each other. And it's kind of a running joke we have out here in LA. Like the tech bros wear AirPods.
Yeah, I have AirPods and I wear them all the time. Like I forget that they're in. It's insane. Like that's kind of insane that we're at that level.
Yeah, and like you said, obviously that's only going to get better. So, you know, hearing things from the outside eventually will be transparent inside of it. While you're also, you know, I think a big space is in-ear tech in general is just going to get better. You know, I think that actually is going to be the wearable of the future. Things like the translation, where it's, you know, translating, you can go to another country and just talk to somebody one-on-one and never have to even change your language of choice. You know, I think that's like a reality. Obviously, Google has been experimenting with that. It's not to the point where it's like going to hit critical mass yet, but in-ear technology in general with audio is a huge thing.
Yeah, and I mean, one of the things I saw is like early prototypes of different kind of in-ear technology stuff had I saw one version that had like bio data. So
exactly.
like you could measure heart rate and the amount you're sweating and things like that. And if you think about how big wearables are in terms of like capturing data and the whole movement around that, like there's a good reason to believe that might move off of the wrist and onto ears. Like, and you might be able to capture more data that way. So like, it just seems like if that's wearables, all of that stuff is just going to lead to people being more connected to audio all the time, which is going to drive a large demand for a ton of new audio content.
Right. Yep. And going into the wearable thing, I do think we're going to see more like progression in in-ear wearables versus like the eyeglass wearables in the foreseeable future, at least until Google Glass actually becomes cool.
Yeah. I mean, I had a pair of like the Snap glasses and they were like kind of cool, but like at the end of the day, that's just like some of that stuff's just awkward.
Right. Yeah.
Like,
I have them as well. Yeah. And people didn't like the fact that they were being recorded. They could see the light blinking, things like that. Yeah. It was kind of awkward.
People, I don't think people are quite socially ready for that yet, but like they're definitely there. I think there's a lot of people like you guys who are sitting around in an office with music going on wearing headphones.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, totally. All right. So let's just do a quick fire round.
Yeah.
So we talked about barbecue in the intro. What is your favorite barbecue dish?
My favorite barbecue dish is Texas, would be a Texas beef rib. I used to live in Austin, and that's probably the greatest piece of barbecue I've ever eaten.
That actually sounds amazing. And it's almost, well, it's not quite lunchtime here, but it's almost there. What is your favorite sci-fi movie and book?
Favorite sci-fi movie? Probably like Blade. I love Blade Runner. The original Blade Runner is up there as one of my favorites. Primer is a smaller indie sci-fi movie that I really love about time travel. Favorite sci-fi book of all time is definitely Dune, the first Dune. I read all the Dunes. Most of them are terrible. The first one is amazing. And then the recent one I read was The Third Body Problem, which is a really creepy, weird, bizarre sci-fi book.
That sounds like a new Weird Work podcast episode. That's cool, man. You just touched my heart with the time travel thing. Back to the Future is mine. That's my
nice.
And I'd have to say, I'm really excited for Ready Player One. I read the book. It was amazing, and I'm looking forward to the movie.
Oh, yeah, that one's going to be great. That's going to be a super fun movie.
Excited about that. And what is your favorite podcast currently outside of Weird Work?
Oh, man. My favorite podcast outside of Weird Work. Let's see. I mean, I'm really like Radiolab as one of my like tried and true ones that I find to be super interesting. I've started listening to 99% Invisible recently and just find that podcast to be fascinating. I'm a huge fan of Hello from the Magic Tavern, which is a very silly podcast where it's this comedy podcast that's from the magical land of Foon, and they interview different magical creatures that live there each week. So it's like improv comedy podcast that's just absolutely hilarious. Yeah. And so, but I mean, I try and pick up and listen to a lot of different podcasts and just try and learn from a lot of what they're doing. But yeah, those are some of the ones I really are kind of my tried and true ones, but I'm always picking up and listening to new ones.
That's cool. All right. And last thing, where can everybody find you on the internets?
So on the internets, you can find me. We have @WeirdWork. My Twitter is SB Balter, just my name. You can reach me at HubSpot at sbalter@hubspot.com.
Cool. We will link everything up in the show notes. Sam, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for taking out the time.
Thank you so much for having me on the podcast. This was super fun.
Cool. Yeah, thanks, we had a really great time and obviously got some good content out of it. You guys can find us anywhere on social at Run with Tobe, and you can check us out on Apple Podcasts. We're also in Spotify and anywhere else you can find a podcast. We'll see you guys on the next one.